One, two, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, audio test.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good, excellent.
Pablo, could you tell something? Great,
Yes,
okay,
hello.
I can hear you. Great, okay.
Okay.
I'm going to get a glass of water. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Okay.
And how many people are there more or less watching?
It depends on the panel. I don't have statistics for the last day, but I believe that several dozens, surely.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Great. So thank you. As we are on there now, so I believe we may start the next panel. But first of all, greetings to the brilliant audience of the 6th PhilosophyCon Metaphysical cover that is watching us via YouTube. I'm Maciej Stanek of the University of Silesia, and I'm both pleased and honored to guide or to moderate this panel that is entitled as one of the Lovecraft novel, I mean, The Quest of Iranon. We have two papers scheduled for this part of the conference. Let me announce our speaker, Mr. Pablo Oscaris and Mr. Will Wiles. I would like to thank you both for participation. Before I will finally quiet down, a single remark concerning the order of our meeting. So each speaker, as I told you before, will have 20 minutes for his own. After the speeches, we'll have some time for the discussion. I would advise you to take care about the time once more, and I will make you some memos regarding remaining amount of it. But if you would try to extend this, I will have to interfere in a brutal or monstrous way, but I hope it won't be necessary. So the last thing, I would like to ask our audience to post some questions on our chat, thus I will be able to ask them to our participants during the discussion. You are more than welcome to do this. Let discussion live. And let the show begin. I would like to invite our first speaker, I mean Dr. Pablo Oscaris from the Rey Juan Carlos University of Madrid and Public University of Navarre, Pamplona, who will present a paper, Dreams, Archaeology and Classical Antiquity in H.P. Lovecraft, The Very Old Folk. Pablo, 20 minutes are yours. Go on.
Okay. So thank you very much, and good evening. And before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers of the 6th PhilosophyCon conference for contacting me to talk about a subject I am passionate about. Let's see if the presentation works properly. I hope it's you can see it the problems. Well, a few years ago, I was looking for information on the internet about a topic related to the Vascones. I came across Lovecraft's story, The Very Old Folk. When I read it, I could not get over my amazement. It brought together a story by a world-famous writer, the Roman Hispania, the administration of the province Hispania Citerior, the people of the Vascones, and the city of Pompelo. Well, I was born and I live in Pamplona, the ancient Pompelo. I speak Basque, a language that seems to derive from that of the ancient Vascones. And the subject of my doctoral thesis was the Roman administration of the province Hispania Citerior. Therefore, the subject suited me like a glove. The story was sent by letter to several of his friends in November 1927. The best-known one was sent to Wanderai. Lovecraft related a dream that had impressed him with its vivacity about a threat inhabiting the mountains of the indigenous Vascons. The citizens of Pompelo, the most important city of this ethnic group, requested help to the Roman legatus, whose headquarters were in the city of Calaguris. The problem was an old folk that lived in the mountains together with the Vascons. On the night before the calendars of May and November, strange ancestral rites took place in which people who had been abducted the previous days were sacrificed. That year, they expected a real massacre, as the Pompelonians had killed 3 of the members of this ancient people. Lovecraft himself, under the name of Lucius Cellius Rufus, convinced the provincial governor to go to Pompelo with the entire cohort of the 12th Legion and other officers to help the inhabitants of Pompelo. Being there on the day before the calendars of November, macabre drumming began to be heard from the nearby. The Legion went into the mountains where the sounds were coming from. As they were ascending, they were attacked from all sides by hordes of savages who massacred the entire cohort. The death of the governor is told in a tremendous way. He died while uttering these last words: Malitia vetus est, venit, tandem venit. That is, evil is old, it comes, therefore it comes. At that moment, Lovecraft woke up. He attributed the dream to a subconscious, long and forgotten memory. He ends by stating that there is no record of the cohort, but it saved the city. For the encyclopedias tell of the survival of Pompelo to this day, under the modern Spanish name of Pompelonia. Apparently, the story goes no further. At first glance, part of the episode looks inspired in the text of the Call of Cthulhu. However, when the specialists in classics start to scratch beyond the surface, he finds that the whole story is full of surprises, as if Lovecraft had planted it with Easter eggs, waited to be discovered by readers in the future. These are some of the ones I have found. For anyone who wants to go deeper into the subject, he can download my article, which is freely available on academia.edu website. The first question comes to us. Is this dream a simple literary resource of the writer, or was it a real dream? Lovecraft, in a letter sent to Frank Belknap about the same dream, states, "As to my Roman dream, well, young man, I hate to be naive, but the fact is that most of it really was a dream, just as Randolph Carter and certain part of Cephali's were." Modern studies on psychology support that this statement could be true. According to Volkeri, Lovecraft can best be understood as an unusually gifted big dreamer who specialized in the exploring the elemental axis of prototypical dream. Well, what most caught my attention were the details inserted in the text. For example, the names used for the Roman characters. The names seem to be very well chosen. Scribonius Libo, Helvius Sina, Cellius Rufus, Acelius, or Bibulanus. After analyzing all of them, we find that Lovecraft had a systematic method for choosing names for his Roman historical characters. In some cases, he uses real names taken from the most important senatorial families of the Roman Republic, like Publius Scribonius Libo, the governor, but also from secondary characters mentioned in the texts of Seneca or Cicero, like Lucius Cellius Rufus, the Roman name of Lovecraft himself, or Tiberius Annaeus Stilpo, the edile of Pompelo. He uses the same nomen and cognomen, but changes the praenomen. All the praenomina are changed. In this way, he makes these names unique. His use of names shows that Lovecraft had a very specific knowledge of the senatorial families of this era. He himself states in another letter to Morris W. Moe in 1930 that the modern age is none of my goddamn business. I am an old man lingering amongst the good old 1900s and 18th century and the Ciceronian era at Rome. Well, another point that caught my attention was the governor's last words in Latin. Malitia vetus, malitia vetus est, venit, tandem venit. I have not found such a literal quotation, but it is remarkable that the words tandem venit seem to appear together only on 4 occasions in all the Latin literature, one of which interests us. The episode is very suggestive. In a dialogue of the Troades of Seneca, again Seneca, when the city of Troy fell and its women were crying and groaning in pain, in a conversation about despair, the desire to die and not being able to achieve it, and the fear of death, Andromache says that there is still a greater evil to come. At night, when the 7 stars had turned their shining car, at last long and familiar and calm therefore came, and then went. And a brief slumber stole o'er my weary cheeks, if indeed the stupor of a mind all dazed be slumber, when suddenly. In the same place, the next verses of Seneca describe a dream in which a spectral Hector warns her about the danger his son was in. In his description, Seneca uses words like stars, war, torches, slaughter, flaming, weeping, disorder, shadows, ancient blood. I cannot imagine a more Lovecraftian text. All these words are present in the burial folk. Please be aware that the Latin words that have brought us this far, tandem venit, have no connotation related to terror or death or anything like that. But the similarities with Lovecraft's text are obvious and probably far beyond coincidence. At the moment when the cohort is being slaughtered, Lovecraft himself looks up at the sky and makes the following description. And as the torches faded, I watched what I thought were fantastic shadows outlined in the sky by the spectral luminosity of the Via Láctea, as it flowed through Perseus, Cassiopeia, Cepheus, and Cygnus. Then suddenly all the stars were blotted from the sky, even bright Deneb and Vega ahead, and the lone Altair and Fomalhaut behind us. So much detail caught my attention. Lovecraft's fondness for astronomy is very well known. Is it possible that this arrangement of the stars was hiding something else? As in the rest of the details of the story, there is something beyond appearances. Is Lovecraft here describing correct distribution of the stars of the sky from Roman times of Pamplona, in Europe, or the sky of Providence, USA, where the author made most of his astronomical observations? Well, first of all, in 2000 years, there is not a significant variation of the arrangement of the celestial vault. Therefore, today's sky would have been the same one. What does change significantly the celestial vault is the geographical latitude. The next coincidence is that the latitudes of Pamplona, 42.81 north, and Providence, 41.82 north, are incredibly similar, and although separated by 5,564 kilometers, the stars would appear the same at both locations. The sky described in this paragraph corresponds perfectly to the dusk of 31st of October, the date on which the narrative occurs in its latitude. Was Lovecraft aware of this coincidence? Most likely, and since the sky coincided with the place he knew best, he could easily write this fragment without considering the issue. In the same fragment, Lovecraft includes a key piece of information to show his knowledge of astronomy, the reference to the star Fomalhaut. According to the perpetual solar calendar, on 31st of October, 45 BC, the sun set at 6:02 p.m. According to the story, when leaving Pompelo, it was already the sunset, and as it is indicated, that it took them an hour to reach the hillside. The ambush happened after half an hour of ascent, so it would not be unreasonable to think that the incident would have occurred between 7 and 8 p.m. At that latitude, at 7:30, the star Fomalhaut is in the sky only between the 24th of September and the 22nd of January. Here you can see the star Fomalhaut. I don't know if you can see the point, but this is only in the sky on these dates, only for some hours at that time, and not all the year, but only from the 24th of September at the 22nd of January. So inserting this star in the description on its back to the south in November it's a clear Easter egg. Well, we must mention that Lovecraft's story contains also several similarities with a famous medieval story that happened in this land, the Battle of Rontesvaes. In this case, the great Charlemagne went to Zaragoza in the 9th century AD to fight against the Muslims. Failing to conquer the city, on his return, he destroyed the city of Pamplona. In revenge for this, when his troops were retreating towards France, his rear guard was attacked in an ambush in the wooded and mountainous area of Rontesvaes by hordes of Bascons who massacred them. A well-known poem recounts the event. The climax of the story is the death of the main general of his army, the famous Roland, who died sounding the horn to warn Charlemagne. Both stories took place in the same geographical context, the mountain forests of Navarre, with the same attackers, a mass of indigenous people, and with a civilized army as the victim, sure of its forces when entering such a place. The scene of the ambush as a revenge for something happened in Pamplona, the massacre and the epic death of the leaders, drawing their last breath, are parallels that may be casual, but looks like a reinterpretation of the myth. Anyone who has basic knowledge of the medieval mythology would have known about Roland and would link the Bascons with the image of ambush and massacre in a mountainous and wooded area. I have decided to leave for the end the coincidence that struck me the most because of my specialization in the provincial administration and because it is, perhaps, the one that best demonstrates the erudition of the right. it is strange, this relationship that Lovecraft establishes between the city of Pompelo and Calaguris. The capital was in Taraco, much farther away than Calaguris. Then why place the army and the members of the administration in Calaguris? I think I can provide a hypothesis about where he could get this idea from, and at the same time, the main structure of the plot of the dream. This precise scheme is only found in another very different ancient document, the inscription CIL 2959, CIL 2959. The inscription, dated on 119 AD, was made when a problem arose in real Pompelo, because this is a real inscription, that could not be solved by the inhabitants of the city. The people from Pompelo wanted to ensure that they had legal support from the provincial Roman authorities. The legatus juridicus of the province, Claudius Quartinus, being in Calaguris, sent a letter back confirming their capacity to act. The text is this description is this letter that he sent to the people from Pompelo. The letter, dated on October the 7th, was copied on bronze and should have been hanging in the walls of the forum of the city of Pompelo. It was discovered in 1582 and lost in a later time, but has been widely studied since then in the bibliography of Roman law, especially in those works dedicated to the legal epigraphy on bronze. There are several coincidences between Lovecraft's dream and the inscription. First, Calaguris and Pompelo are two of the 179 opita, small cities, mentioned by Plinius in the province, and the inscription of Quartinus is the only one that points a link between both cities. 2. The format in both cases is a letter. 3. The Roman administrative headquarters in the story are located in Calaguris. No other data, except the inscription of Quartinus, suggests that the affairs of Pompelo were managed from that city. 4. The plot is set on Pompelo, and the intervention of Rome takes place at the request of the highest ranking officers of the city, an aedile in one case and the duumviri in the other. 5. In both cases, the people from Pamplona asked for help to the legatus based in Calaguris. Why him and not other officer such as the governor or the commander of the cohort or the legion? 6. We find legal text written in bronze of fundamental importance in the story of Roman law in both cases. Lovecraft mentions the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus when talking about the orgies celebrated in the so-called Sabbats, and the Tabula of Quartinus about the trial in Pamplona. Lovecraft could have consulted works such as James C. Egbert's Introduction to the Study of Latin Inscriptions, published in New York, Cincinnati, and Chicago in 1896, which was widely read. Here, and in many other books of legal epigraphy, both inscriptions are mentioned a few lines apart. We cannot assume with absolute certainty that the reading of the letter in the bronze would be in the subconscious of Lovecraft when generating the dream, but the idea is very likely and suggestive. To conclude, as you have been able to see, a small narrative of a few pages contains many examples of such erudition that sometimes can be surprising. Could Lovecraft manage in his head all this information within simple letters that, a priori, were not intended to be published? I must admit that the coincidences I have found have given me goosebumps on several occasions. The story does not end here. In other letters, Lovecraft provides more information about the dream and his plans to publish and develop the story, something that I will continue to study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo, very, very much for this brilliant speech and for taking care about time. So very punctually, I would like to invite Will Wiles, who will present a paper entitled Never Quite Deserted, Architectural Decay, Ruins and Desolation in H.P. Lovecraft and Others. Please go on, Will. 20 minutes are yours.
I'm afraid I don't have the professional presentation that Pablo has given us. It's just me speaking, I'm afraid. But I want to talk about ruins in the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. There are an awful lot of ruins in these stories. And once you start looking for them, it's very hard to stop finding them. Even things that aren't strictly ruins look suspiciously ruinous. Ruins are so plentiful, in fact, that they can start to form into large, unhappy families in the head, which we'll look at in a moment. But first, there's a question that nicely shows up the pervasive sense of ruin in Lovecraft stories. And that's how many new buildings are there in H.P. Lovecraft stories? Lovecraft was never completely confined by antiquarianism. Technology was an important presence in many stories and sometimes the basis of the plot. He has submarines, advanced aeroplanes, portable telephone lines, telegrams, and so on, all form the very important plot components often. So we can be sure that there are at least a few new or recent buildings in these stories, but mostly they can only be inferred. The homes of his characters, even when they're solid and not ruins, are always venerable, described as being old. Sometimes buildings are renovated, like Exham Priory in the story Rats in the Walls, or the castle in the Moon Bog, but the renovation is generally speaking a bad idea in Lovecraft. Home improvement is always a bad idea in Lovecraft, provoking some ghastly underlying horror. There are hospitals, institutions, railway stations, some of which must be recent constructions. Miskatonic University must have parts that are newer than others, but these new buildings are never described and they're never given any identifying detail. The stories of Lovecraft simply do not smell of fresh paint. Ruins, however, are everywhere. Of course, this isn't unexpected, as ruins, antique buildings and architectural remains are the stock in trade of the Gothic. Gothic is atmosphere, setting makes atmosphere, and the atmosphere of Gothic is mostly one of decay. But in this talk, I'd like to make a categorical survey of Lovecraft's omnipresent ruins as a way of talking about what architecture means in these stories. First of all, to get them out of the way, there are the fairly conventional Gothic or supernatural ruins that crop up in the early tales. Notable mostly for their peculiar magnetic qualities. These include the underwater city found by the stricken submarine in The Temple, written in 1920, or the rather unexpected Greek settlement in Ireland, which lies concealed beneath the swamp in the Moon Bog. These are not distinctively Lovecraftian relics, instead showing the author still incubating in the influence of Arthur Machen and others. And this is reflected in their conventionally classical architecture. They exert a fatal psychological hold over their story protagonists who are irresistibly drawn towards them. Tombs, generally of the ancient and ruinous type, also serve a similar purpose in the stories The Tomb in 1917 and The Statement of Randolph Carter in 1919. At the other end of the spectrum, and those are the fairly conventional ruins in Lovecraft. At the other end of the spectrum, in what we might call the god tier, or the elder god tier, are Lovecraft's later ruined cities. There are three in particular, all built by extraterrestrial visitors to Earth, and thankfully all hidden away in parts of the world. Probably the most famous is R'lyeh, Cthulhu's slime-encrusted, non-Euclidean capital city, submerged beneath the Pacific, where the squid-headed god lies dreaming away the strange aeons. This is memorably described in The Call of Cthulhu in 1926. Close behind in fame, and the most extensively and evocatively described in any story, is the sprawling, unnamed Antarctic city of the Elder Things at the Mountains of Madness in 1931. Very similar, perhaps, if we're being honest, about the depth of Lovecraft's wells of creation, too similar, is Nahkotos, the great race of Yiths, city of learning and time travel that lies buried under the sand of Western Australia and is described in The Shadow Out of Time, 1934. Beyond these three, there are others, such as the Arabian ruin in the relatively early story, The Nameless City, 1921, and the lost city of a vanished civilization in the Congo, which appears in another early tale, Arthur Jermyn, 1920, both of which might be seen as prototypes for the three great ruined megacities that are at the heart of Lovecraft's fame. One unifying feature of these places is that they're never quite as deserted as they seem. R'lyeh, of course, is still tenanted by Cthulhu. A couple of elder things are revived in the Antarctic, and unfortunately so is at least one of the Shoggoths, their formless bioengineered slave creatures. And in Western Australia, Nathaniel Wingate Peasley finds a trapdoor open and ominously recent footprints in the dust of Nakotas, suggesting that a flying polyp might still be at large. These lingering residents raise an interesting question about ruins. Do they have to be deserted? Ruination has a purely structural quality. A ruin is a building that has experienced severe decay, either as a result of the passage of time or owing to a disaster. To be considered ruined, as opposed to simply damaged or poorly maintained, this decay has to put it somewhat beyond use, to have made it no longer useful for what it was built for. And ruins are therefore often disused places, sometimes long disused. Ruination is associated with abandonment and desertion. This is an essential part of what makes a ruin a useful component in a Gothic or ghost story. It's the expectation of abandonment that makes the presence of a spectre, ghoul, or shoggoth all the more alarming. A ruin, in a way, is a place that should be abandoned. But they seldom are abandoned. Edward Gibbon conceived of his history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire while sitting amid the ruins of the capital, but he wasn't alone. He was watching the barefooted friars singing vespers in the Temple of Jupiter. The grand tourists who visited Rome found the spectacle of its ruins only heightened by the beggars and shepherds that lived in their shadow. So is a ruin a place abandoned by its original inhabitants, left for squatters, degenerate descendants, and tourists? Not necessarily. A neglected house can fall into ruin with its resident in place. As structural decay advances, the building drifts beyond wholesome use, but its inhabitants cling on. Even when they look seemingly empty and desolate, even when we look at seemingly empty and desolate ruins, we are there ourselves. The pure ruin, in magnificent desolation, occupied by no one, exists only in the mind. Once we clear our mind of the tourist board image of the ruin as a fragment of castle wall standing aloof on a headland, we can see that nearly everything in Lovecraft takes place in a ruin. I had somehow taken it for granted that the house was abandoned, says the narrator in the picture in the house. Although old, rattling, and almost opaque with dirt, the windows were not broken. The building then must still be inhabited, despite its isolation and general neglect. There are a great number of ruined, near-ruined, or semi-ruined houses in the stories. I've mentioned Exham Priory, which starts as a ruin before it is unwisely renovated in The Rats in the Walls. The story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, turns on discoveries made in the townhouse of the sorcerer Joseph Curwen, a place now crumbling with age, and later progresses to the surprisingly expansive basement vestiges of Curwen's farmhouse. This is another story where home improvement proves disastrous. Similarly, the witch Keziah Mason's former home in the Dreams of the Witch House has dreadful secret that undoes Walter Gilman stitched into its very fabric as a building. Wooden panels and concealed voids also feature in the Peabody heritage. The Whately farmhouse in the Dunwich Horror is described as a near ruin, and its family are described as living in the 3 least ruined rooms. Here, home improvement is the active work of evil, not merely its misguided trigger. Another house with boarded up windows, which are described as being very sinister in the Whately farmhouse, is the half-decayed Waite mansion in The Thing on the Doorstep, and another Whately house has boarded up windows in The Shuttered Room. We could also mention the shunned and deserted Martens mansion in The Lurking Fear, and the mysterious castle in The Outsider, which is infinitely old and infinitely horrible, topped by the partly ruined Black Tower, which contains the secret of the narrator's nature. But besides ruined houses, there are also ruined and neglected towns. Witch-cursed, legend-haunted Arkham, whose huddled, sagging gambrel roofs and crumbling Georgian balustrades brood out of the centuries beside the darkly muttering Miskatonic, is perhaps Lovecraft's most famous setting, but it seems to have some life in it yet. More deserted and ruinous still is the fishy port of Innsmouth. Collapsing huddles of gambrel roofs form a jagged and fantastic skyline, above which rose the ghoulish, decapitated steeple of an ancient church. A city of stark desolation, he calls it. The village of Dunwich, home of the aforementioned Whateleys, is a cluster of rotting gambrel roofs bespeaking an earlier architectural period than that of the neighbouring region. Most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and the broken steepled church now harbours the once slovenly mercantile establishment of the hamlet. It is always a relief to get clear of the place. So there's two recurring images here, broken steepled churches and gambrel roofs. These are clearly on Lovecraft's mind. The gambrel roof is worth a bit of describing. It's a feature of colonial New England vernacular architecture, a wooden roof that changes from a shallow to a steep pitch halfway down. If you try and picture a barn as drawn in a children's book, and I have here an ancient tome of forbidden lore, Richard Scarry's best word book, it has an example. This is like a classic children's book barn, and it has a gambrel roof. I'll just hand that up. This is a gambrel roof, a roof that changes pitch halfway down. And so that's the classic New England barn type roof. But the main feature of the crucial feature of houses with gambrel roofs, apart from simply their age, is that not very many of them survive. They're rarities, even on their own, and clusters of them are rarer still, almost unpleasantly rare, for they suggest that that in that particular location the usual action of time has been suspended. So these houses and towns are survivals, eerie, seemingly impossible survivals. In a sense, they're things that should not have survived. And in that ghastly survival, they operate a horrible ability to traverse time. Old Keziah Mason uses the uncanny geometry of the witch house to transcend past, present, and future, escaping from the witch trials and projecting herself into her future, Lovecraft's present, to possess Gilman. Poor old Charles Dexter Ward's interest in antique architectural details dooms him to possession by Joseph Curwen, and the old man in the picture in the house is unspeakably old, much older than he should be. This is the eerie quality of ruins. They operate as a time machine. A ruin has a threefold existence, like Keziah Mason. It projects itself through history, like one of the great race of Yith. Exists in the present for us to look at, but it obviously comes from the past. All buildings, of course, bar the very newest, could be said to come from the past. But there are very many old buildings that come from, and there are very many old buildings that come from further past and yet are not ruins. But they have been kept up by us. They are maintained constantly by the present generation. The important thing about the ruin is that it has continued without our intervention. It is the worse for wear, but it persists without our care and attention. It exists despite us. A ruin is an inhuman survival. It doesn't need people. The disturbing implications of this last thought give ruins the uncanny ability to project into the future. We are looking at something that has continued without us, and we imagine what will continue after us. As Denis Diderot wrote in his essay on the Salon of 1767, our glance lingers over the debris of a triumphal arch, a portico, a pyramid, a temple, a palace, and we retreat into ourselves. We contemplate the ravages of time, and in our imagination we scatter the rubble of the very buildings in which we live over the ground. In that moment, solitude and silence prevail around us. We are the sole survivors of an entire nation that is no more. Everything comes to nothing. Everything perishes. Everything passes. Only the world remains. Only time endures. How old is this world? I walk between two eternities. Wherever I cast my glance, the objects surrounding me announce death and compel my resignation to what awaits me. In its pessimism and nihilism, and its awareness of the deepness and awfulness of time, both in the past and in the future to come, this is a strongly Lovecraftian sentiment. The painter who prompted these reflections in Diderot was Hubert Robert, whose enthusiasm for the subject matter led to his nickname Robert of the Ruins. As well as romantic views of Roman ruins, Robert painted pictures of existing buildings, such as the Louvre, fallen into similar states of ancient decay. And he was not the only ruin lover in the Salon of 1767. There was also Pierre Antoine Demacky, another architecture painter with a peculiar specialism in buildings being demolished. Ruins were a hugely popular and lucrative subject. Why was this? Though it has scarcely been appreciated, the cult of ruins this is a writer called Nina Dubin, I'm quoting from here, writing in Cabinet magazine in 2005. Though it has scarcely been appreciated, the cult of ruins coincided with the emergence of modern market structures, and market forces appear to have catalyzed an awareness of contingency that 18th century artists and aesthetes brought to bear on their apprehension of ruins. That's Nina Dubin's words. A rising culture of risk and speculation in commercial enterprise with the attendant possibility of disaster and financial ruin contributed to a public appetite for painted views of more scenic ruins. The ruin lust of the late 18th century rested on the precarious feel of the age with its revolutions and financial panics. It is the architecture of this age, the 18th century, that Lovecraft was most drawn to. I am unable to take pleasure in anything but a mental recreation of other and better days, he wrote in 1925. And only architecture could create this effect in him. Architectural detail completely absorbed him, and his letters are filled with discussion of the minutiae of windows and mouldings. When I think of 1725, I want to be able to see 1725, he wrote to Donald Wanderai in 1927, and to know clearly what types of buildings were then surviving, what types were then being built. I can then roughly block out my scene and drape it in as much mist and mysticism as I choose. As time goes on, my taste for urban panoramic effects increases. At the present time, I'm really more sensitive to architecture than any other art, save the weird wing of prose literature. The vistas I relish the most are those in which the sunset plays a transfiguring and glorifying part. Sometimes I anyway, he goes on and on, but absolutely nothing else in life has the power to move me so much. For in these momentary vistas of sunset over distant spires, there seem to open before me bewildering avenues to all the wonders and lovelinesses I have ever sought. A lovely sentiment, but it is accompanied by vast ugliness. The last species of ruin that Lovecraft uses in his stories is the slum. Urban squalor was a source of great inspiration to Lovecraft, and we can recognize the author's own feelings in the words of the artist Pickman in the story Pickman's Model, when he talks about the aesthetic inspiration to be derived from the north end of Boston. God, man, he says, don't you realize that these places weren't merely made, but actually grew? I can show you houses that have stood 2 centuries and a half and more, houses that have witnessed what would make a modern house crumble into powder. This was based in a real locale, and Lovecraft was distressed when it was demolished. Pickman's notion that ancient buildings in the slum grew like living things reminds us how often he used organic language to describe ruin and architectural decay. The transfiguring and glorifying power of the sunset is fully and chillingly expressed in the story The Haunter of the Dark, the slum district of Federal Hill in Providence, with its bleak, decayed squares, ascending avenues of century-worn steps, sagging Doric porches, and blear-paned cupolas, exerts a deadly fascination over the story's protagonist. Despite his best instincts, he tries to find those streets for himself. And what he finds in the ruined church there gives him good reason to fear the sunset. And in The Haunter of the Dark, it's one of his last, The Haunter of the Dark is one of his last and best tales. But just as in Pickman's Model, when Lovecraft talks about the immigrant inhabitants of these neighborhoods, the ugliness begins to seep through the scenic effect. And this is perhaps even uglier and more acute in the horror Red Hook set in Brooklyn, which is described as a maze of hybrid squalor, a tangle of material and spiritual putrescence, again with an ill-omened church at its heart. Here, the note of bodily disgust and moral condemnation clearly sounds. Lovecraft's slum settings are sadly where his phenomenal racism manifests most unavoidably, and parts of those stories are pretty unpleasant to read as a result. And in the stories, he was toning it down. It's even worse than the letters. I found one monstrous and blasphemous neighborhood whose existence I had never suspected, a region actually inhabited by degraded and human forms of life, Lovecraft wrote to his friend Frank Belknap-Long in 1926. I won't go into this, but it repeats the sentiments found in the previous stories to a much more vivid and disgusting degree. For Lovecraft, the New England culture of the 18th and 19th century was the lost Eden, regarded in what he steeped in what he regarded as wholesome Northern European influences. And industrialism and the immigration that it brought were the original sin. It is explicitly stated of Dunwich that industry did not flourish here, hence its preservation. But it's striking that he doesn't really idealize the colonial age. On the contrary, a reader could get the opposite impression. The true epicure in the terrible, to whom the new thrill of unutterable ghastliness is the chief end and justification of existence, esteems most of all the ancient lonely farmhouses of backwoods New England, Lovecraft writes in The Picture in the House. And for there, the dark elements of strength, solitude, grotesqueness, and ignorance combine to form the perfection of the hideous. The unnameable has a quite evocative condemnation of the mindset of Puritan New England, which I won't quote at length. No beauty, no freedom, the poisonous sermons of the cramped divines. And the inhabitants of Arkham and Dunwich aren't, or especially Innsmouth, aren't representatives of nobility to Lovecraft. They're stunted and inbred horrors that are decayed by their separation from the world. Charles Dexter Ward, a Lovecraftian Mary Sue, if there ever was one, fulfills his wish to communicate directly with the colonial era, with a colonial era ancestor, and finds calculating, selfish evil waiting for him. Lovecraft, in short, was never happy, and that's his saving grace. I contend that had he been a cheerful... Yeah, okay, that's the end. I've got one more paragraph. Had he been a cheerful and optimistic racist, some of his contemporaries, he'd now be unreadable. That ancient ensemble of buildings and spires glimpsed at a distance in a golden sunset is plainly an image that wouldn't leave him alone. But up close, when that fairyland is visited and inspected, it is always found to be rotted and vile and ruined. Not a gilded dreamland, but a ruin. Here, I think we can see his acceptance of the vanity and folly of his nativism and the inaccessibility of his antiquarian longing. Lovecraft's ideas of the ruin, his whole reactionary mental project, lovely from a distance in the sunset, resolves into decrepitude and squalor close up. It can never be delivered and always contains a lie. But in between, he leaves us with that yearning image and delivers the wonder which he regarded as the highest purpose of art. Sorry for going on a bit.
Thank you very, very much for your speech. Well, we have some questions from the audience. Maybe since Will has just spoken, maybe let him have some break. And first question to Pablo. It's more a comment, but maybe you would have some impressions on that. I quote, "For me, the plot of the very old folk with Roman and ancient elements resembles stories by Arthur Machen, whose works, by the way, were very, very admired by Lovecraft," unquote. Pablo, would it be possible to have any comment from you? I'm putting it on our chat for you.
Okay, yes. I'm sorry because I don't... maybe it's something that I shouldn't say, but I don't know the stories of Arthur Machen. Or it's probably this person is probably right, because this story takes you to many other kind of stories. What is incredible is all the coincidences that one finds. I found lots of different topics to compare. Of course, everyone will find different ones, maybe, but in this case, what is striking is that the coincidence is also geographically. It's the topic of the story. It takes me to those to the Battle of Rontesvaes or to this inscription. Not only because of the topic, but also because of the geographical origin of these stories and of this inscription. But I'm sure that it's not closed. So maybe he's right. I can't say anything
okay,
else.
Thank you so much. If I may, I would like to supplement this question a bit, since you say it is a kind of coincidence that can be found. But is there anything for sure that you can claim for sure that yes, indeed, Lovecraft has seen this letter or this table or any of this ancient or medieval document?
Well, in the case of the inscription, what I can say is that Lovecraft read things about epigraphy. In the old folk, he is speaking about these orgies, and he says, as is told in the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus. So he knows that inscription. This Senatus Consultum Bacchanalibus in the books is usually in the same chapter as the inscription which I have mentioned, in which the people from Pamplona ask help to the legatus who is in Calaburris. No other inscription, no other literary, no other text puts in contact those two places. So, I mean, it's for me, it's clear that he must come from here, but I have no text that is saying, well, yes, I saw this inscription in this book.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, next question is for Will. I will gather them together and also send you via our chat. Just give me a second. The first question is, are descriptions of architecture needed? And from the same person, how to describe the background well to attract attention, what to look for. I'm sending it first and the second via our internal chat.
Yeah. Needed in what terms? I mean, in terms of the architect, in terms of the stories of Lovecraft, I would say that they're that dark descriptions of architecture are absolutely inseparable. It's very hard to think of Lovecraft stories without these kind of quite extended, sometimes multiple paragraphs of descriptions of decaying, sagging gambrel roofs and teetering spires and so on, which are such a feature of so many stories, like the Dreams in the Witch House and so on. There's again, the non-orthogonal, non-Euclidean ruins are again such a characteristic of Lovecraft at the Mountains of Madness and the Nameless City and the Shadow Out of Time. These baffling, paradoxical alien cities. I think that these descriptions of ruined and decaying places are probably completely indispensable. Without them, we wouldn't have Lovecraft's stories. In terms of whether they're needed for the Gothic novel in general and the horror novel in general, this is a question that's very, very dear to my heart, because I wrote a whole novel attempting to show that they aren't needed. I wrote a novel. I wrote this novel, The Way In, which is an attempt to do a Gothic novel or a Lovecraftian cosmic horror in an entirely new building, a building that is so new it still has polythene on some of the furniture, with no burial ground underneath it, with no ominous part. It's just in a completely denatured landscape, as an attempt to create that kind of cosmic Gothic horror feel in a new environment. And that was partly a sort of challenge set to myself. And I obviously personally I think I did an all right job of it. There are other writers who have done similar things. There's a novel called Horror Store by Grady Hendrix, which is a sort of rather Lovecraftian story set on an IKEA megastore, so I don't think they're necessary for broader Lovecraftian and Gothic weird tales. I think modern settings can work just as well, although obviously the ruin produces so much of the kind of scenic effects naturally. And the second one, how to describe background well to attract attention, what to look for. That's an interesting question. I mean, Lovecraft uses in his stories a lot of this as I mentioned in the talk, a lot of this kind of quite bodily language. You know, his buildings, his decaying buildings, have kind of maladies. They have rheumy eyes and blear pain. That's like film, like cataract covered eyes. You know, and you know, they have this kind of like overtones of disease and decay that relate to the body, and so we kind of feel the sinisterness of them on a kind of medical level. I mean, you know, Gothic. I mean, one of the reasons why I love Gothic fiction is simply for its. I mean, I've always been, you know, interested in architecture. I have a master's in research in architecture, and it's the most architectural form of fiction. You know, setting is so important to it. Buildings live in Gothic fiction. You know, so anyway, I've spoken long enough. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answer. There are some more questions for you on our chat. I will ask you, if I may, if you'll be so nice to enter our YouTube transmission and maybe answer them directly. But there is one that corresponds to what you have just told about. So about this non-Euclidean nature of Lovecraft's architecture. And there is a question, what do you precisely mean? How do you understand this non-Euclidean nature of Lovecraft's architecture?
The what nature of Lovecraft?
I will.
Well, where is the chat? How do I access the chat? I can only bring up the direct.
It's on our YouTube channel. I will send you a link just for a moment. But this question is at the end of point number 2.
Yeah, the end of point number 2, the non-Euclidean nature. Yeah, it's interesting because Lovecraft is clearly, I mean, in the early stories, you know, which I mentioned, stories like The Temple, which is about the stricken German submarine, and the moon bog and so on. The architecture he describes is very classical. You know, it's recognizably kind of Greek or Roman, and he obviously tries to, when he's describing alien cities, he tries to purge his language of architectural language. He instead, you know, so he doesn't talk about columns and Doric orders and so on, and he tries to talk about just plain geometrical objects and so on, cones and spheres and so on. But in order to just make it sound more, you know, to give it that edge of weirdness, he describes it as being non-Euclidean. These are cones, but they don't behave as cones. There's something off about them. You know, the famously, one of the characters in the story, The Call of Cthulhu, is swallowed by an angle, and you know, an angle of one of the buildings doesn't behave the way it should, and eats him, consumes him. The story in The Nameless City is described as having all the proportions are off. You know, this is clearly not classical architecture. So in terms of the dreamlands, and you know, the plateau of Leng and its old temple, which is related to this other question that's been asked here, and the idyllic vision of Boston from the quest for Unknown Kadoth. The dream. I mean, he talks constantly. Lovecraft talks constantly about working to create this effect of wonder, this kind of fairyland twinkle of wonder that he was obviously what he sought from fiction and what he conceived of when he thought about. You know, it was really kind of, it feels like almost like the only thing he loves. You know, this frisson of wonder. And he tries over and over to create this in different ways, including with the stories. I find personally, this is just a matter of taste, that the Dreamlands fictions don't quite work for me as stories. They're less interesting than the ones set in our world. And although often the writing is very evocative, I find that the stories of Clark Ashton Smith create that kind of sense of horror and cosmic otherworldliness rather better in books like The Abominations of Yondo and so on. Lovecraft is pursuing this Dunsany and Lord Dunsany kind of vision, and I think he has kind of mixed effects. It's better when it's a feature in the more grounded stories. Shall I answer this other question as well? I'm worried that I'm just doing nothing but
well, if you may, but if you can do it in
okay.
Much abbreviated way.
Do nowadays horror and weird fiction genres work better at places steeped in history, or maybe non-places, as Marc Augé describes shopping malls? Well, I mean, I attempted to do very much a non-place fiction in The Way In. That was my whole idea. It's partly based on Rem Koolhaas's essay Junk Space about hotels, conference centers, shopping malls, and so on. I think that's where the kind of cosmic horror kind of can reside now. I think that will be my feeling, is that I wouldn't want to say what anyone should be doing, but I think that there's plenty of cosmic horror that can be derived from those settings. The danger in using the ruined castles and haunted houses and so on is avoiding cliche, because they've been so heavily used by so many writers that it's very hard to avoid reiterating what has already been said.
Thank you very much for this answer. So, Pablo, Will, thank you very much for participating. Unfortunately, we have to finish and make a dot right now, since we have very, very tight schedule. And thank you very much. Please feel free to have a look at our transmission on YouTube, and you can answer maybe some further questions, since there occurred just right now, some of them. So thank you very, very much. Have a brilliant day, and stay tuned. Maybe you will join the PhilosophyCon in the next edition. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will join.
Mateusz is back.
Yeah. Okay, Mateusz is back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will, Pablo. I hope to see you again, and maybe we'll have much more time for the discussion.
Okay.
Great work. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Bye. Hello, Russell.
Hi. Hello.
Maciej, would you stay here for?
Okay, no problem at all. Okay,
just to see
so
if someone is.
I'm staying here. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, no problem at all.
We are going to breakout room.
Okay, see ya. Take care.
We're not streaming right now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. We are.
Sorry, you're really echoey. It's hard for me to hear you.
Yeah, you're just really silent, Mateusz.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the sound is somehow strange.
Oh, it's much better.
Yeah, better.
Yes, I am. I was telling Camilla that I'm nervous. I've never done a PhilosophyCon before, and I've never done a presentation about like this topic before. So I hope it goes well. I mean, I'd love to. Yeah, I love all the events. I love like small. I love events from like 50 people. I love events that have like 50,000 people. I love them all. Yeah, I figured since we're doing Lovecraft, I would focus on the Cthulhu books that we did. Awesome. So, as I was telling Matej, I'm kind of nervous because I've never been to a PhilosophyCon before, and I'm not a like Lovecraft scholar. I'm just a fan of Lovecraft's work, and I'll give you a confession first. My confession is I don't think Lovecraft is a great horror writer. I think what he does better than any other horror writer, though, is he built a mythology that is incredibly rich and complex, almost by accident. And by doing that, and I say that because many scholars say that Lovecraft did not, his goal was never to create a mythos. Like that came after Lovecraft was alive. What he created was like something in the background that lived under all of his stuff that he could reference. But in doing that, he did something that almost no other mythology has ever done before, and have had poor replicas since. He created a mythology that was absent religion. So every other mythology before Lovecraft that dealt with gods, almost all of them had religion at the center of it. And because they had religion at the center of it, they relied on worshipers, like worshipers to fund the religion. And so humanity was at the center of all of these religions and mythologies. And what I always responded to about Lovecraft is his gods did not care about humanity at all. Like they were a non-factor. It was almost as if like we were ants to them. Whereas in Greek and Roman and Egyptian and every other mythology, and I love them all. Like I love mythology. That is the thing that I love more than anything. Humanity was at the center of it. These gods who were incredibly powerful and omniscient and omnipotent somehow had this great love for humanity, all of them across the board. And I always responded to how Lovecraft's gods just did not care. It wasn't that they hated humanity or they loved humanity. I mean, some of them did. Like Nyarlathotep clearly has like a jonesing for humanity, but most of them don't care at all. Like they don't think about humanity. And I always thought that was more true to how I would see gods and monsters myself. I thought that would be how gods would actually react. Maybe they would be as horrific looking as Lovecraft's monsters. Maybe they would be as beautiful as Greek gods, but they would have their own stuff going on that was that did not have humanity not only at the center of it, but not even as a part of it. I thought, though, that the one failing of Lovecraft's work was that he always centered the story on a human. He didn't spend a lot of time dealing with the mythology itself. In fact, my favorite god, Azathoth, the idiot god, the